May 16th, 1811. A muddy ridge in southern Spain. Lieutenant Colonel William Inglis lay on the ground, canister shot lodged in his neck, blood soaking into the mud beneath him. Around him, the 57th Regiment of Foot was being systematically destroyed by French musketry at ranges measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. Men fell in heaps, the line wavered, and Inglis, unable to stand, bleeding out in the Spanish dirt, shouted 6 words that would echo through British military history. "Die hard, 57th, die hard." What followed was 4 hours of the most brutal infantry combat of the entire Napoleonic Wars. British regiments losing 2/3 of their men and refusing to break. French cavalry charging into British squares at point-blank range. Spanish troops fighting alongside British infantry in desperate hand-to-hand combat. And through it all, men like Inglis, wounded, dying, but absolutely refusing to surrender, holding a ridge that should have been impossible to defend. This is the story of Albuera, the battle that gave us the phrase, "Die hard," the day when British infantry proved that courage, discipline, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to break could stop an empire, and the moment when one regiment lost 480 men out of 728 and still held the line. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into what Wellington himself called a near disaster that somehow became a victory, not through brilliant tactics or genius strategy, but through British infantry doing what British infantry does best, standing in line and dying hard rather than running. Because Albuera wasn't a clever battle, it was a slaughter, and the British won it anyway. But before we get to those devastating volleys and that famous shout, before we watch regiments disintegrate under fire and somehow keep fighting, we need to understand why this battle happened at all. Because without knowing why Marshal Beresford was defending a ridge in the middle of nowhere, you can't appreciate what made Albuera so desperately important. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into Britain's military heritage, make sure you're subscribed. We cover the battles that shaped the nation, the moments of impossible courage, the victories that shouldn't have been possible, the days when everything hung by a thread. Let's go back to early 1811, when Wellington's Peninsular campaign was entering its crucial phase. Wellington had driven the French out of Portugal. Now he needed to secure the Spanish border fortresses, particularly Badajoz, a massive fortified city that controlled the main invasion route between Portugal and Spain. Whoever held Badajoz controlled the war's strategic balance. In March 1811, Marshal Soult captured Badajoz for France. Wellington needed it back. But Wellington was busy fighting Marshal Massena in northern Portugal, so he sent Marshal William Beresford, a capable if unspectacular commander, to besiege Badajoz with a mixed Anglo-Portuguese-Spanish force. Beresford began the siege in April, but his siege train was inadequate. The old Portuguese cannon couldn't breach Badajoz's modern fortifications. Progress was slow. Then came word that Marshal Soult was marching north from Seville with 24,000 French veterans to relieve Badajoz. Beresford had 2 choices: continue the siege and risk being trapped between the fortress garrison and Soult's field army, or lift the siege and confront Soult in open battle. Beresford chose battle. He selected a defensive position at Albuera. a low ridge overlooking a small Spanish village about 12 miles south of Badajoz. Beresford's army numbered about 35,000 men on paper, 10,500 British, 10,000 Portuguese, and 14,500 Spanish troops under General Blake. But coalition armies are complicated. The Spanish were brave, but poorly trained, their regiments shattered by years of defeat. The Portuguese were better. Wellington had spent 2 years drilling them, but still not quite up to British standards. The British contingent was small but professional. 2 divisions of veterans who'd fought through the Portuguese campaigns. Soult approached Albuera on May 15th with about 24,000 French infantry and 4,000 cavalry. His troops were veterans of a dozen battles. They'd conquered half of Europe. They expected to brush aside the mixed Allied army and relieve Badajoz within days. Soult's plan was clever. Feint at the Allied left near Albuera village, then swing his main force around the Allied right flank, roll up Beresford's line, and drive the Allies back toward Portugal. On the morning of May 16th, the armies deployed. Beresford positioned his troops on the ridge, with his British divisions on his right wing, the sector he thought most vulnerable. He was right. Soult's feint at Albuera village tied down some Allied troops, but his main attack, General Girard's division supported by massed French cavalry, swung wide around the Allied right, exactly as Soult intended. The Spanish saw them coming. General Blake's Spanish troops, positioned on the far right of the Allied line, turned to face the French flanking column. These Spanish soldiers had been defeated repeatedly over the previous 3 years. Nobody expected much from them. But at Albuera, they fought like lions. Spanish infantry formed squares and held against French cavalry charges. Spanish musketry tore into French columns. For nearly an hour, the Spanish held the ridge alone, while Beresford redeployed his British divisions to support them. Then everything went wrong. Major General William Stewart, commanding the British 2nd Division, received orders to move his troops to support the Spanish right. But Stewart misunderstood or ignored the tactical situation. Instead of deploying his brigades in line with proper intervals, he marched them forward in column formation. Vulnerable, exposed, perfect targets. And he marched them directly into Soult's trap. What happened next was carnage. French cavalry, Polish lancers and French dragoons had been waiting for exactly this mistake. They charged into Stewart's brigades while the British were still in column, unable to form square or defend themselves properly. In minutes, 3 British battalions were destroyed. The 3rd Buffs lost their colours and nearly 600 men. Other regiments were shattered. Stewart's division, which should have been the decisive British reinforcement, instead became a disaster. The French sensed victory. Girard's infantry pushed forward, driving back the Spanish, overrunning British positions. The ridge was being lost. French drums beat the advance. This was the moment when battles collapse, when one side breaks and the other pursues with bayonets. Beresford's army was on the edge of disintegration. But then Houghton's brigade arrived. 3 British battalions, the 29th, the 48th, and the 57th, perhaps 1,700 men total. They'd been held in reserve, waiting for orders. Now they marched forward, deployed from column into line under fire, and advanced toward the French, who'd overrun the ridge. This was British infantry at its most professional. deploying under fire, maintaining perfect spacing, advancing with bayonets fixed, while French musket balls tore through their ranks. The fighting that followed was unlike anything else in the Napoleonic Wars. Not the quick clash of cavalry or the methodical exchange of artillery. This was infantry combat at ranges so close that men could see each other's faces. British and French infantry stood 30 yards apart and fired volleys into each other's ranks. Men fell by dozens with each volley. The lines closed, 20 yards, 15 yards. Still both sides kept firing, reloading, firing again. The 57th Regiment held the center of Holton's line. They deployed perfectly, their line dressed as if on parade, and the French artillery had perfect range. Canister shot, tin cans filled with musket balls that exploded from cannon like giant shotguns, tore through the British ranks. Each blast killed or wounded a dozen men. The 57th's line thinned. Gaps appeared. Men stepped forward to fill them and died filling them. Lieutenant Colonel William Inglis commanded the 57th. He was a veteran of 20 years' service, a professional soldier who knew his men and knew their limits. And he watched French canister systematically destroy his regiment. Then one canister blast hit him, iron balls tearing through his neck and lodging in his back. Inglis collapsed, unable to stand, bleeding heavily. His officers rushed to carry him to the rear. He refused. Inglis lay in the mud behind his regiment's line, the regimental colours planted beside him, and watched his men die. The French kept firing. The British kept firing back. Neither side would retreat. This was the pure mathematics of attrition. Whichever side broke first would lose everything. And Inglis, lying wounded, knew that if the 57th broke, the entire British line would collapse. So he shouted, "Die hard, 57th, die hard." Think about this for a moment. You're a British soldier. You've been standing in line for an hour, firing volleys at Frenchmen 30 yards away. Half your comrades are dead or wounded. Your colonel is lying in the mud, bleeding out. French canister is tearing through your ranks with every shot. The man next to you just had his head taken off. What do? Run, or stand and keep firing? Let me know in the comments what you would have done. The 57th stood. They kept firing. They kept dying. And they refused to break. Around them, the rest of Houghton's brigade was suffering similar casualties. The 29th lost over 400 men. The 48th lost 350. Every battalion in the British line was being bled white. But nobody ran. British infantry discipline, drilled into men over years of training, held firm even when everything else failed. The stalemate continued. British and French infantry stood at point-blank range and killed each other. The Spanish, recovering from their earlier battering, reformed and joined the British line. Portuguese troops moved forward to support the flanks. What had been a French breakthrough became a desperate deadlock. Neither side could advance. Neither side would retreat. Then Marshal Beresford finally committed his last reserve, General Lowry Cole's 4th Division, fresh troops who'd been waiting behind the Allied line. Cole saw what needed doing. He formed his division into line and advanced through the smoke toward the French position. His troops, British Fusiliers and Portuguese infantry, fighting side by side, struck the French right flank, just as the French were exhausted from the brutal firefight with Houghton's brigade. The French line buckled. Cole's Fusiliers charged with bayonets. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted across the ridge. British soldiers and French soldiers stabbing and clubbing each other in the smoke and mud. French officers tried to rally their men. British sergeants pushed their companies forward. For minutes, the battle hung in absolute balance. Then the French broke. Not routed, these were veteran troops who'd conquered Europe, but pulled back in good order, reforming further down the ridge. They'd suffered terrible casualties and couldn't sustain the fight. Soult, watching from a distance, realized his breakthrough had failed. The British line, which should have been destroyed, still held. But holding was a generous description. The British brigades that had fought on the ridge were devastated. The 57th Regiment of Foot had started the battle with 728 officers and men. By the time fighting ended, only 85 were unwounded, 66% casualties, 2 out of every 3 men dead or bleeding. And they'd never retreated. They'd stood in line, fired their muskets, and died where they stood because that's what Lieutenant Colonel Inglis had told them to do. Inglis himself survived, though barely. He was carried off the field with canister shot still lodged in his back. It would stay there for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of Albuera. His 6-word command, "Die hard, 57th, die hard," became regimental legend. The 57th Regiment would forever after be known as the Die Hards. The phrase entered British military vocabulary as the ultimate expression of steadfastness under fire. The Battle of Albuera ended around midday. Soult pulled his army back, abandoning his attempt to relieve Badajoz. But he'd inflicted terrible damage. Allied casualties totaled nearly 6,000 men, 4,159 British, 1,368 Spanish, 389 Portuguese. The British had suffered over 40% casualties among the troops actually engaged in combat. Some regiments were destroyed as effective fighting units. French casualties were similarly horrific. Estimates range from 6,000 to 8,000 killed and wounded. Soult lost a quarter of his army trying to break the Allied line. He'd captured some British colours and artillery, but strategically he'd failed. Badajoz remained under siege, though the siege would ultimately fail for other reasons. Wellington arrived 3 days later and surveyed the battlefield. The ridge was covered with dead and wounded from both sides. The smell was indescribable. Thousands of corpses rotting in the May heat. Wellington walked through the carnage and said something that captured Albuera's horror. Another such battle would ruin us. It was a victory, but barely. The British had won by refusing to lose, by standing under fire that should have broken any army and somehow not breaking. But Wellington also understood what Albuera proved. British infantry, properly led and supported, could hold against anything. The 57th had lost 2/3 of its men and never wavered. Other regiments had suffered similar casualties and kept fighting. This wasn't luck or tactics. This was discipline and courage at a level few armies in history have matched. The story of the 57th became legendary in Victorian Britain. Artists painted Inglis lying beneath the colours, urging his men forward. Writers retold the tale of the regiment that died hard rather than retreat. School children learned about Albuera as an example of British steadfastness and courage. The phrase "die hard" entered common language as shorthand for absolute determination in the face of impossible odds. Even today, the 57th Successor Regiment, the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment, commemorates Albuera every May 16th with a silent toast to the men who died on that ridge. Officers and sergeants drink from a special loving cup, honoring the memory of soldiers who stood their ground when everything, tactics, casualties, common sense, said they should run. From a French perspective, Albuera was frustration incarnate. Soult had executed a clever flanking maneuver, exploited British mistakes, achieved local superiority at the decisive point, and still lost because British infantry simply refused to acknowledge they'd been beaten. French soldiers fought bravely, charged courageously, died in heaps, and accomplished nothing because British squares and British lines held no matter what was thrown at them. The battle also highlighted the complications of coalition warfare. Spanish troops fought well initially, but couldn't sustain the French pressure. British commanders made tactical errors that nearly cost the battle. Portuguese troops performed credibly, but not decisively. Only the combination of Spanish courage, British discipline, and Portuguese support won the day. Barely. Perhaps what's most remarkable about Albuera is how it captures something essential about British military culture. There was no brilliant maneuver, no clever trap, no genius strategy. Just men standing in line under murderous fire and refusing to break. Not because they were superhuman or fearless. Casualty lists prove they died like anyone else. But because their training, their discipline, and their pride wouldn't let them run. Inglis personified this. Wounded, unable to stand, bleeding out. And his first thought was encouraging his men, not saving himself. He could have been carried to the rear. He could have let someone else command. Instead, he lay in the mud and shouted at his regiment to die hard. That's British military leadership at its finest. Officers sharing their men's danger, leading by example, dying alongside the soldiers they command. The phrase, "die hard," has outlived the battle and the regiment. It's entered global English as shorthand for determination against impossible odds. Films, books, military units worldwide use it. Few people know it comes from a muddy ridge in Spain, where a wounded colonel told his men to stand and die rather than run and live. But that's where it started, with Inglis and the 57th, May 16th, 1811. Albuera also demonstrated the limits of Napoleonic tactical doctrine. French columns, which had conquered Europe, broke against British lines at Albuera because British musketry and British discipline turned linear warfare into a science. French courage was never in question, but courage without the ability to deliver sustained, disciplined fire was just a faster way to die. The British had mastered the art of standing still and shooting, and at Albuera, that mastery proved decisive. Within weeks of Albuera, the strategic situation forced Beresford to abandon the siege of Badajoz anyway. French reinforcements arrived. The British pulled back. Albuera's tactical victory led to no strategic gain, but it proved something vital, that British infantry could win the bloodiest battles through sheer determination. This confidence would carry through the rest of the Peninsular War and beyond. The casualty figures bear repeating because they're almost unbelievable. The 57th Regiment, lost 66% of its men. The Buffs lost 70% of their strength. Several other regiments lost half their men. These weren't skirmishes or quick fights. This was sustained close-range combat, where men stood and died because their officers told them to, and because British military culture demanded it. And it worked. Against all logic, against every tactical principle that says armies break when they lose 30% casualties, British infantry at Albuera held until they'd lost 40%, 50%, 66%, and still didn't break. That's not normal. That's exceptional. That's what made British infantry feared across Europe for a century. The men who died at Albuera deserve to be remembered not just as statistics, but as individuals who made choices. When Inglis shouted "Die hard," each soldier chose to listen. They could have run. Nobody would have blamed them. The regiment was disintegrating around them. But they stayed. They kept loading muskets with hands slippery with blood. They kept firing into smoke so thick they could barely see. They kept dying in ranks because that's what British infantry did. This is why Albuera matters. Not because it was strategically decisive. It wasn't. Not because it showed tactical genius. It showed tactical mediocrity, rescued by infantry courage. But because it revealed something profound about what makes armies fight when all reason says they should flee. British infantry at Albuera proved that with discipline, leadership, and absolute refusal to accept defeat, small groups of men can hold against impossible odds. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the desperate stands, the moments when courage overcame casualties, the battles where British infantry proved they'd die before breaking, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.